Hi, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining the Darien Library. We're just letting people in the room, so let me give people about a minute to get in, and we'll start pretty much on time. You're in for a treat. We have an amazing author, David Guterson, tonight with his latest book, The Final Case, which is quite spellbinding. And I'd also like to thank our friends at the library who make these programs possible. So let me tell you a little bit about David. David Guterson is the author of several novels. The national bestseller, Snow Falling on Cedars, East of the Mountains, Our Lady of the Forest, a New York Times notable book and Los Angeles Times Best Book of the Year, The Other, and Ed King. He is also the author of 2 story collections, 2 books of poetry, a memoir, and a work of nonfiction, Family Matters, Why Homeschooling Makes Sense. The recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, David lives in Washington State. And we're so happy he joined us. He's joining us this evening. Our moderator is his editor, Diana Miller. She's been an executive editor at Alfred A. Knopf, where she has been since 2003. Among the award-winning authors whose books Diana has acquired and edited are Essie Edugan, author of The Washington Black, Richard Flanagan, The Narrow Road to the Deep North, which won the Booker, Evie Wild, All the Birds Singing, Elliot Ackerman, whose Dark at the Crossing was a finalist for the National Book Award. Diana also works with Lila Motley, Ann Tyler, Garth Risk Callerberg, Javier Marias, Joe Baker, Jonathan Lee, and Sonali, which I'm not even going to try to say her last name, and Jane Smiley, among others. We are so lucky to have these 2 with us this evening. Please type your questions in and we will get to them at the end of the program. And welcome both of you and thank you for spending time with us.
Thank you, Kathleen, and welcome everybody. You can ignore the screaming children in the background. But I'm so glad to be here with David. We were just talking before the event that we actually haven't met face to face before this because of these strange times we're in. But I wanted to just ask David first to say a little bit about the book for anyone in the audience who hasn't read it yet.
First of all, I want to thank the Darien Library for inviting me, and also to the bookstore that's selling, books tonight there, which is Barrett's, I believe, Barrett's bookstore. The Final Case, this is a book based on a trial that unfolded here in Washington State, north of Seattle, in a rural county in 2013, in which a couple was charged with homicide and the death of their adopted daughter. And the book lays out the particulars of that case and all its sort of tragic dimensions. And at the same time, it presents the final case of an attorney who's now in his 80s, who happens to be the narrator's father. So there's sort of parallel tracks here. One is the story of this elderly criminal defense attorney as he moves through his final case. And the other is this tragic story of this homicide in a rural county here in Washington.
And I know, and I know you've spoken about this before, that you had, you attended the actual trial and sort of took notes and wrote pages toward actually writing a nonfiction account. Can you tell us more about why you switched gears?
I can, and I think to do that, I should probably back up a little bit. So my wife and I, we adopted a girl from Ethiopia. And this family in the county north of Seattle that I mentioned earlier also adopted a girl from Ethiopia using the same adoption agency and approximately at the same time. And so in 2011, when I heard about this death, I was immediately interested for personal reasons and and concerned and began to track the case, as an adoptive parent and also as a member of the adoptive community that had become part of the larger Ethiopian diaspora community in the Seattle area. And all of us were concerned about this matter and tracking it. So I started out as an adoptive parent, not as a writer, as far as my interest in this goes. And then in 2013, in the summer, the trial was underway, and I still had no, clear idea in my head that I was going to write a book. But as the summer went on, and this was a long trial, it began to coalesce in my head that indeed, there may be something here that I should be writing about. And it never occurred to me that it might end up to be fiction at that point. I undertook this initially as a nonfiction project, and then I ran up against a kind of wall because I had some background as a journalist, as a nonfiction writer. I was a contributing editor at Harper's in the 90s, and I had done plenty of short form journalism, but I'd never really done book length nonfiction before. And I found I don't think I'm really put together such that I can do it. I just ran up against a wall, really, and I began to imagine it more in fictional terms. And it occurred to me that during that summer of 2013, as the trial unfolded, at the same time, my father, who was in his 80s and who was a criminal attorney, was in a steep decline, and he died that fall. So for me, emotionally and psychologically, that summer, these two things were converging. And when this book finally manifested its fiction, both of those things entered into it.
And the narrator of the book is also a writer. And are you hoping that readers will see you in the narrator, or is this just a coincidence?
Well, this book is very much a work of realism, and in the realistic mode of storytelling, you're working to get readers to willingly suspend their disbelief. That the more they believe that what they're reading is true and real, the more deeply they enter into it, and push away their natural tendency to view what they're reading as merely fictional. When you read science fiction or you read fantasy, you don't have this issue. People accept from the get-go that they're in an alternative universe. But when you're in the realistic mode, you want your readers to willingly suspend their disbelief. So you do what you can to make that happen. And one way to do that is to blur the line between the narrator and the author, so that the first person narrator very well could be the author. And in fact, this novel begins, well, there's a prologue, but chapter 1 begins with the narrator saying that, he's been a novelist for a long time, but he's quit. And that's simply another move in terms of this attempt to get readers to willingly suspend their disbelief. If the teller of this story used to be a novelist and no longer is, then what you're about to read must be real. So I think my motives were very much, practical in terms of what a writer is one of the things you're attempting to do is to draw the readers into the reality of the story by blurring that line.
And what do you think some of the things that writing this story as a novel enables readers to understand or enabled you to communicate? You mentioned these events converging in your own life, but for a reader approaching it as fiction, how is it different for a reader than sort of reading a true account of these things?
Well, it is the case that certain real life stories do lend themselves very well to a book length account. This one, it was simply too complicated. For example, there were actually 2 adopted children. Now, both from Ethiopia, a boy and a girl, in the real world. In the fictional world, I felt that that would disperse the emotional energy of the story, and I like to keep it centered on one person. So I did away with that real life element. And that's just one example of the ways in which, when you're working in the fictional mode, you can shape things. You're not tied to reality. You can shape things in a way that meets whatever your intentions might be in terms of what the reader experiences emotionally, intellectually, as they go forward. So I've always been more comfortable in the fictional world having that kind of ability to. Well, I'm not tied to the real world. I can make my way through the path of the story in the way that allows me to best meet my objectives as a storyteller.
And one of the things that moved me personally about the book is that even though you're starting with these two sadnesses or 2 tragic events, the murder of a girl, the death of a man, coming to the end of his career, there's also a lot of love and fellow feeling and sort of hope for humanity in the book. Is that a balance that you had to really work to achieve?
I think that partly came out of just something we spoke of earlier, was my inability to approach this as a nonfiction writer. It was just relentlessly too sad and tragic. I mean, there's a bit of a balancing act when you're working with material of this type. On the one hand, you really want readers to bear witness to the truth. You want them to see what happened. You want them to acknowledge the reality of this occurrence. On the other hand, you know that if you stay too long in the world of darkness and violence, that people are going to want to turn away. And so you have to find that balance point between not too much and not too little, allowing the reader to bear witness and not turn away from reality, but not push them so far that they want to close the book. And one of the ways I sought to do that was to surround the trial with a context that was more hopeful and more loving. And in fact, that turned out to be not just a strategy that allowed for a more sustained emotional engagement from readers. It also turned out to be very much thematically useful in terms of my intentions in the book. It allows, for example, a point of contrast. You can examine one family and you can ask yourself these questions, what's wrong here? Why did this happen? What is the source of this nightmarish set of events? And you can place those in this larger context of a family where love really is, at the heart of things. And I think by juxtaposing those two, you're able to think more productively about both.
And one of the wonderful relationships in the book, I think to this point, is the narrator's marriage. Can you tell us a little bit about Allison and how that relationship works?
Yeah, I've always enjoyed writing about that sort of thing. In Snow Falling on Cedars, there was a substantial element of young love, for example. In East of the Mountains, it's there again. In this book, it's a more sort of mature relationship, and these are people who meet in some, well, in the course of an earthquake, which was a bit, well, it was fun. It was fun to write. And
yeah,
they sort of immediately hit it off in the way that, you know, in a romantic way. I mean, they just really connect right from the beginning. And the marriage that you learn about in the course of the book, you know, it feels like a good one. I think it feels like a happy marriage. There's one element of it that they sometimes have some regrets about, and that's the fact that they never had children. It's not as if that's, you know, at the center of their lives in some way, but, you know, here and there, there's a pang of regret about it. But generally speaking, these are two people who are really, really good for each other. And it's the kind of marriage in which each of them stands in their sort of independent way in the world, but they build each other up. They nurture each other. It's not a needy kind of relationship where one person feels dependent on the other. There's just mutual respect and mutual affection.
It's so much fun to read. Also, one of the things they share is a love of books and poetry and reading are so important to the novel. Would you tell us a little bit about some of the other books that come into the book?
Yeah, well, let me think about that. There's one episode where, well, the narrator, he has a sister who owns a tea shop, and she happens to give Allison, the narrator's wife, a copy of a book called The Book of Tea, which is a pretty strange book. And she quotes from it while they're out eating. They enjoy language together. And later in the book, she's reading him a few of these. They're called Japanese death poems. They're the final haiku of written by Japanese haiku artists or Japanese Zen Buddhists at the end of their lives, knowing the end is near. They'll write kind of a final haiku. And these are all collected in a book. And she's got this book and she's reading him some of them. And it provides fodder for conversation and for them to contemplate, you know, aging and mortality. So there are a couple of examples of books that make an appearance in the final case.
And I wanted to talk also, I mean, you referenced the trial and how the trial works within the novel. And I think a lot of people might come to a book that's set around a trial, expecting the trial to sort of be the beginning and the end, to be the machinery that kind of moves the reader through the book. But it works pretty differently in this novel. Can you tell us about that?
It does work differently. I mean, for example, Snow Falling on Cedars, you could accurately call it a courtroom drama. And a trial is a natural, has a natural beginning, middle, and end. It has a narrative trajectory. It has a question at the beginning of guilt or innocence. It has rising action, and it has sort of climactic moment of guilt or innocence and a sentencing and a denouement, which is why there's such a thing as a genre called the courtroom thriller, because what happens in the courtroom really lends itself, you know, to storytelling, and you can engage that structure as a storyteller, and you can, you know, from beginning to end, and that's, you know, that's what John Grisham does, for example, over and over and over again. Now, in the final case, there is this element of the trial. It's basically the middle of the book. There's a lot that precedes it, but in the section that precedes it, there's the feeling that you're building towards something. You're building up to the trial. You're moving toward the trial. So if you're a reader, you can feel like, well, this makes sense. This is, you know, getting us into the courtroom. And then in the middle of the book, you get into the courtroom and, you know, witnesses take the stand and evidence gets presented and arguments get made. and you feel that you're in the middle of a courtroom drama that of the sort that you're accustomed to, familiar with, and then that ends. And there's another third of the book to follow it. And it's my hope was that everything I did in that final third, every scene, every interlude, every meeting of characters, every moment, whatever happens, would all in some way resonate with the larger concerns that have been raised by the two earlier sections of the book. You know, so to me, none of it seems extraneous. Like, I have a thematic vision for this book. I know what I'm trying to do in terms of the book's meaning and purpose, and everything I included in that final section is meant to contribute to that in just the way that the trial is. So it does work against expectation, I think. You know, when you see a book called The Final Case and you say it's a courtroom drama, you expect it to go a certain way. The fact that it works against expectation is something that a lot of readers I've noticed like. They like being surprised, and they feel like, well, now there's a challenge of how is he going to make everything in this last third of the book somehow relevant. And to me, there's a certain degree of respect for the reader in it, that the reader can engage this material and find those resonances and make those connections, and not just feel that the writer is wheeled off, you know, into another galaxy. And I like that. I like the idea that you don't have to force feed the story to the reader. You respect the intelligence of the reader, and you let them discern why these scenes and characters are here and how they relate. I think there's a much greater enjoyment and appreciation of a book when the reader is allowed to do that. The reader is allowed to be intellectually present, have their mind engaged, rather than just being simply, you know, told in the most concrete, sort of obvious way what the story is. So I had all of those, you know, concerns in mind, and I definitely had some trepidation about the last third of the novel. And I remember speaking with you about this. We more than once went over that last third of the novel and talked about maybe there are 2 or 3 scenes here that aren't quite working, that don't quite resonate. And there was some editing that went on there that frankly made the book much better, for which I thank you.
It's always a fun process. I wanted to also, I mean, speaking of the trial, the fact that the father in the book, Royal, is a lawyer, and you mentioned that your late father was a lawyer. And I don't want to give too much away about how the trial does actually unfold in the book to risk spoiling it for anyone, but how do you feel about sort of trials and lawyers, and whether that's a good way to bring justice to the world in a case like this, or is it an effectual way? What do you think?
It's a great question. And I think we're at a really good cultural moment in this country where we are rethinking what we mean by justice. And, you know, justice can take many paths, and it has cultural meaning. It depends on where you are in the world. There's such a thing as restorative or reparative justice. There's such a thing as punitive justice. In this country, we have tended to date to simply be, in many ways, punitive. Somebody does something illegal, and we say you must pay the price. And the price is we're going to take away your freedom, or in some cases your life, and we think that somehow constitutes justice. To tell you the truth, I don't really feel that. I don't really. It doesn't make sense to me, and it never has. But even in a trial like this one, where these 2 people, who in the book are called Delvin and Betsy Harvey, these are these they're conservative, right-wing, fundamentalist Christian people with 7 biological children who adopt, this girl from Ethiopia, and they have very strict ideas about child rearing, and they're punitive in their way of child rearing, and it just simply. You could easily say to yourself, well, these people deserve to go to prison for the rest of their life. They're awful and they've done an awful thing. And I could feel that around me on the day of the sentencing, the sense of retribution, the punitive feeling, the people that the public wants the criminal to pay is really important to people. And I can say I wanted them to pay, but I also felt really sad about it. It was just all tragic. It was tragic all the way around. It was tragic for the people who'd found guilty and were going to prison, for one of them for 27 years, one for 37 years. It was tragic for the girl who died and her family in Ethiopia. And I would have much preferred to see something done that might have been restorative or reparative in some way. That rather than having these people languish and sit in prison cells for decades, that maybe there was something they could actually do of substance that would redress this wrong to some degree. It can never be entirely, undone. It's a death, it's final. But certainly steps could be taken that would be more productive and feel more like justice to me anyway, than having them languish in prison.
And do you feel that there are sort of questions of good and evil at play here, or is that too simplistic?
I think there is such a thing as good and such a thing as evil, particularly in the case of people who you might sort of end up labeling as psychopaths or sociopaths. These are people who are incapable of empathy for other human beings. And it doesn't bother them in the least to, say, kill or injure or sadistically hurt other people. And to me, that fits in the category of evil, But I think for the most part, most human beings are neither. And most human beings are both. Most human beings are just a muddled mess of emotions, and we ride up and down on waves of, of tone and mood in our lives. And sometimes we're good and sometimes we're not, And it's hard for me to really look around me in the world at other human beings and say, I think that person is good and I think that person is evil. I just see other people who are like me, conflicted, confused, not really sure about things, muddling through. Maybe I tend to believe that most people do the best they can, but that most people are trying to be good. I'm kind of like more optimistic about humanity than I think some people are. But then I read the news and I see what Russian soldiers are doing to civilians in Ukraine, and I think maybe I'm completely off base. People are just so many people are capable of just horrific behavior. And sometimes I think of that Robert Frost poem, Mending Wall, mending being a verb. These two neighbors are getting together to mend a rock wall. They go out there every spring. And the narrator, who's a sort of a Frost-like figure, looks across at his neighbor and he says, I see him there like an old stone savage armed. He moves in darkness, it seems to me. And there's this wall between them. On the other side is somebody who may be in the ethical and the moral sense and the spiritual sense, in all the ways that matter, really different from you. And that's scary. And I have come across people like that where I feel that distance and that wall. So, evil is a real thing, but for me, I think most human beings are simply, we're doing our best and we're confused along the way.
Well, and I mean, that reminds me, one of the audacious things in the novel is you give a voice to Betsy Harvey's mother, Mrs. Huber. I don't want to get that wrong. I think Mrs.
Yeah.
Huber.
Mhm.
What led you to that choice, and how do you think that works in the story?
Well, there's a sort of motif, I guess you would say, in this book of diatribes. There's 3 sustained diatribes in this book. One of them comes from the mother of the of one of the defendants, Betsy Harvey's mother, is Mrs. Huber. And the diatribe, I think it's 3 or 4 pages long, that she delivers is, you know, you could draw it from all of the fundamental complaints that you hear on the right in this country today about the left and about people who are woke and so on. You know, it's basically a sort of endless stream of that sort of complaint, that sort of rant. And it speaks for itself. This goes back to a point I made earlier about wanting to really respect, you know, the reader, that the reader sees the self-damning quality of it, that the author doesn't have to comment at all on this. It speaks for itself. The author has nothing to say about it. The author doesn't criticize it or celebrate it or analyze it or in any way refer to it. It just gets presented, and the reader can read between the lines and infer from it, not just the politics and sort of social and cultural position of this character, but to me, more important as a storyteller, we now understand much better the defendant Betsy Harvey, the world she came from, the home she was raised in, the mother she had, the father she had. He's in this scene too. And, you know, in a way, we see her, she's more human now for us, Betsy Harvey. She's not evil, as we talked about before. She's a human being with a background, with a childhood, with a family dynamic that in some ways made her who she is. So that was, as a storyteller, that was really my reason for including it, just to deepen the sense of who one of the defendants in the trial is.
Well, and I mean, we're in a moment of cultural discourse when I think it is often hard for people on opposite sides of these issues to listen to each other or to hear what another person is saying. And I mean, that is one of the things that I find so fascinating about the novel, is that, as you say, you present this without judgment and leave it to the reader to make his or her own decisions about it. But you are also forcing the reader to acknowledge this woman's humanity, even if we might find her views sort of repugnant.
And at the same time, you know, I mentioned that there are 2 other diatribes, not quite as long as hers, in the book. And so this narrator is a novelist who occasionally mentors younger novelists. And at one point in the novel, he's mentoring a young writer who is bemoaning the fact that he was born at the wrong time. He's a white male at a time when, from his point of view, nobody wants to hear from white males anymore. That's his diatribe, that's his rant. You know, poor me, I was born at the wrong time. If only I'd been around 100 years ago or 50 years ago, I would be a famous novelist, but nobody wants to hear from me anymore. Why? Because I was born white, I was born a male, you know? And same thing, he goes on and on and on in this vein, and it's self-damning and self-condemning, and the narrator has almost nothing to say about it. There's a little follow-up, but not much. You know, you don't get much of a sense of where the narrator sort of lands, or it all speaks for itself. And later in the novel, there's another one, a sort of young socialist who works at that tea shop I mentioned. And she's upset with one of her fellow employees because she views her as a capitalist and a materialist. And she's quitting her job, and she's engaged in a sustained rant at this other employee for having the wrong values, for not being a socialist, for not seeing that things like tea, for example, are simply exploitation of people in other parts of the world who do all this work to get you your tea so you can sit in the shop and enjoy it and talk about profound things while they starve to death, picking your tea leaves. And she pounds away at her fellow tea server on this point. And again, it speaks for itself. I mean, is she right? In certain ways, she is right. She's not entirely wrong to point out that exploitation sort of rules the world's economy. I mean, she's not wrong. The problem is all of us are sort of stuck in this web of hypocrisy that the structure of our economy steeps us in. We live from day to day in the real world, and in that real world, we drink tea, and we know while we're drinking it that we're engaging in some of the hypocrisy of the world, just like when we drive our cars, and yet are concerned about the global warming crisis. So, for someone to simply beat someone else up for being for not having the right values when they themselves are living the very hypocrisy that they're railing against, to me that's a problem too. And so all three of these rants are, in the end, all of the same, in that there are people who are going to extremes that they're dysfunctional extremes. They don't work. They don't take us anywhere. They don't prove anything.
Yeah. Well, and I wanted to take a moment also to talk a little bit more about Royal, the father and the lawyer, because he's such an upstanding citizen, and he's a man who seems to have a really strong moral compass. And in some ways, I think he's presented as the hero of the book. At the same time, he's defending these two people who have committed this unspeakable crime. How did you reconcile those things?
Well, early on in the book, the narrator gets drawn into his father's work of necessity because of his father's aging, his father's inability to drive, his father's need for help. So the narrator is, assisting his father in putting together this case. And in the early stages of that, his father tells him about the case. And he says, they're charged with homicide by abuse. They adopted a girl from Ethiopia and she died of hypothermia in their yard. And the narrator is aghast. You're going to take this case? How can you do that? I mean, and Royal, the octogenarian defense attorney, says, well, of course I'm going to take this case. I mean, the law has to move on. There has to be a trial. There has to be a defense. Everybody's entitled to a defense. The law has to play out. Somebody has to defend this person. Somebody has to try to convict her. This is the way that we seek justice in this country. Everyone has a role to play. This is my role. And while I'm engaged in this role, I don't have to like the person or agree with the person. In fact, I can take every moment of my involvement in this case and just try to do the best I can with it and be the best I can and leave it at that. And my father was like that too. People would ask him, how can you do what you do? I mean, you're helping criminals get off the hook and you're using legal tricks to keep people from going to jail, and he would say pretty much what I just described Royal as saying, that everyone's entitled to a defense and the law wouldn't work if nobody did it.
Yeah. Well, and I wanted to talk also about the little girl at the center of the book, Abeba, and how because when the book opens, we know that she has died. She is at the center, yet she's also an absence. And I think one of the wonderful things that the novel does is it fills in that absence and it shows us who she was, and that she actually was a very fierce and smart and dynamic person. can you tell us a little bit about her as a character?
I mean, it was really a challenge because, as you say, from the get-go, from the beginning of this book, this is somebody who can't be on stage and in an animated way. She's gone. And and yet you don't want her just to be sort of a two-dimensional corpse, somebody who passed away and we don't really need to know her. To really understand the depth of this tragedy, we need to know who it is, who is the victim of this crime. So I had to find ways to bring her life into the novel. So when the trial, I'd been to Ethiopia twice before the trial as an adoptive parent. But after the trial, I went specifically in search of the family of the deceased. Her name was Hana Alamu. And I went to the orphanage in Addis Ababa where she had been, and they gave me some information, the town she was from and the name of her uncle that she had lived with. And I went to the town, I found the uncle, and I found the cousins that she had lived with. Her parents were deceased. And I learned, everything I could about her. I just kept asking questions and taking notes and and I went to her school, and they had her academic records and her grades in different classes, 2 different schools. I talked to some of her friends, I talked to other relatives, and gradually I put together this picture of a real person. And of course, the more I did that, the more sad it became, inevitably. The deeper you go into the reality of a single human being, that's really what it comes down to. You really can't bear witness and you really can't manifest the tragic dimensions of something unless you can make the victim real. A human being like you and me with a heart and a brain, breathing inside their own point of view, living their own life. And this is what happens to them. And it's because of that, I and others in the larger community I was a part of, we got involved in adoption reform legislation. We testified at a hearing in Olympia, the Washington State Capitol, tried to change some laws because you just don't want to see this happen again. I mean, the more that you come to grips in terms that this happened to a real human being, like my own daughter, who easily could have been, the girl who died. I mean, the more that you find yourself feeling that the way the world is constructed is unacceptable and you want to do something about it.
Yeah, no, it's terrible. It's awful. Well, I know we're supposed to leave some time for questions, but maybe, I could keep asking you questions all night, but Kathleen will come on and tell us when it's time to ask questions from the audience. But and there she is.
Here I am. And did we go on? Let's see, I can't see me, but I assume someone can hear me.
Yes.
We had some questions that were sent in earlier today. Someone did ask about the adoption agency, and was that actually an accurate picture that they track the children, or they know about the future of the children?
Well, what happens in the book is an anomaly because the adopted child ends up deceased.
Yeah.
And that news got back to Ethiopia because it appeared in the media. It was a news story. And so the Ethiopian government became concerned. What happened? We've got this policy here of international adoption. We send these children away. We have an elaborate system before we approve this, in which we try to ensure that we're doing the right thing for this child. This child ends up dead. We need to find out what went wrong. So in this case, there was a sort of working backwards from the death to figure out what had happened. But in general, international adoption, like domestic adoption, has a high degree of sort of privacy attached to it. There are visits by social workers. There are reports that have to be made, but they're unilateral. Parents, no one is coming in to closely examine the conditions of the home. But you are supposed to every 6 months, report.
Someone asked about, because of that title that you wrote on homeschooling, did you homeschool your child? And what are the strengths and weaknesses of that process?
Well, so that book came out in 1992. And I had written an article in Harper's about homeschooling that they ran at the beginning of the school year, like in September of 90 or 91, get people thinking about alternatives to conventional education. And the reason they thought that maybe I would be the right person to write this is because I was a public school teacher, and my wife and I were homeschooling our children, about which there seemed to be a certain irony. But I didn't see any irony in it. The kids are in the school, in the classroom, they need a teacher, and I need a job. I like doing it, so I'm there. But I don't particularly believe in it, in warehousing children in an institution and treating, all 30 of them as, you can't serve their needs. Let's face it, it's an approximation. Public schools and the way they're structured, the institutional nature of public education is an approximation. It's the best we can do. It's what we have to do given the shape of our culture and our society, but it's not the best way to educate people, educate children, So my book is not an advocacy book. I'm not advocating homeschooling. I'm just saying, here's what it really is, and here's our possibilities, and it might work for some people, it might not work for others. It's really just trying to describe what it is for people.
Yeah, I've had a lot of authors who actually homeschool their children. Let's see, who is the most important character and who was the most challenging to write?
Well, the most important character, that's a hard one to answer. Important in what sense, important in what way. You have to give equal weight to people in terms of their importance. So I'm not sure that I can pick somebody. And the most challenging one to write about easily was the girl who died.
Yeah.
The adopted girl who died. Because again, as I said earlier, she's not present. How do I bring her into this book in a way that makes her real when she's already deceased and not part of the present action of the story?
But you did that so well. I feel that when you were reading about her, you really started to feel her and know her and identify with her. How did you feel about the siblings, and how did you want to use them as a tool?
So yeah, in the book, there are these biological children of the Harveys, many of whom testify at the trial. There are 3 older boys, all of whom were complicit in some way. That is, they worked on their parents' behalf in terms of abusing their adopted sister. They took commands from their parents to do things that were abusive. And then there was a girl, a biological child about the same age as the adopted girl, who felt very, very guilty that she didn't stand up and protect her adopted sister from the parents. So these characters are all based on the real children who testified. So the girl I mentioned has had terrible struggles in her life of guilt and mental illness and so on, suicidal tendencies, substance abuse, self-mutilation, anorexia, all of these things. The 3 older boys have, in the real world, suffered and been aghast at one of them told me that he feels like he was at one time, his family was a kind of cult, that he had bought into this cult. So that his mother said, do these horrible things to your sister, you did them feeling like that was the right thing to do. And now he just can't understand how he ever could have participated.
Yeah, so sad, so sad. Let's see, you talked about the attorney being modeled on your dad, and someone asked about that. When you're writing fiction based on nonfiction, how close to the nonfiction do you feel you have to stay?
Well, one of the, as I mentioned earlier, the nice thing about it is the flexibility that you have because it is fiction. I mean, on the one hand, you have all the sort of raw material from the real world that you can draw on. So I have the transcript of the trial, which is, literally thousands of pages of transcripts, and I have my father's files, with literally hundreds of boxes, all of this material that I can draw on. So I have, this sort of rich load of material, but when it doesn't work in terms of what I'm trying to accomplish as a storyteller, then I have freedom to move away from it and be inventive. So I don't really think of the situation particularly as challenging. I think of it as, me sort of having advantages in approaching it that way. When I've written stories that are more purely imagined, it's rougher. You don't have that well of raw material.
Was Snow Falling on Cedars based on nonfiction as well, in particular?
So the island that I live on, everybody here, of Japanese descent was interned or relocated. And I was teaching at the high school at the time, and some of my students were from these families, and I knew people in the community who'd been interned. And all of this was real here. And our newspaper editor in the 40s was very much like the newspaper editor in the book, who takes a stance that, this is the wrong thing to do, that this is just pure racism. So I had a lot to draw on from my own community in writing this book, and Snow Falling on Cedars.
Yeah, that was an amazing book. Someone wanted to ask, do you see this novel translating well to the screen?
To tell you the truth, I don't. I was sort of surprised when the screenwriter approached me before publication, and he knocked on a lot of doors, and actually a person who, at least in the past, would have had a good chance. His name is Ron Bass. He wrote the screenplay for Snow Falling on Cedars. He was at one time known as the Green Light Machine, one of the most profitable screenwriters, working in Hollywood. So if anybody could have gotten it made, you would think Ron Bass, but I thought he was sort of crazy to even try, to tell you the truth. I mean, it's just not the sort of thing that people really want to look at on the screen, I don't think, myself. Yeah.
Well, it's such an interesting story. Someone asked why you did not end with the trial, but you touched on that a little bit.
Ending with the trial. Because this notion of the verdict and the sentence being the culmination in terms of the book's themes or the book's meaning or the book's intent wasn't right.
Yeah.
It was a different ending that needed to come. There was a different culmination that the story required, and it wasn't there at the end of the courtroom proceedings.
How do you see this book working in book groups?
I've visited a couple of book groups with this book, and I'm visiting a couple more. And I think it's a good one, partly because it engenders a lot of culturally relevant conversation, conversation of our time, of our moment. It's a good jumping off point for people to think a little bit more deeply than they might have about some of the issues we're confronting as a culture today. So it's been working well in book groups in that regard.
Yeah, I think it has so many layers for book groups. We did get two basic questions. What is your writing routine, and do you outline?
I don't outline, and I don't have a routine. I'd say where I live, it rains from about October till March, and it's cold, and I just stay inside a lot more and write, which I really like. It's fun to look out the window. It's raining. I'm sitting there writing. But once, and here it is April. I mean, I'm not at my desk doing very much very much writing because there's a lot to do outside. So I guess I don't really have a rigorous schedule, where I'm treated like a job, not, I'm going to be at my desk every day. I just roll with what the seasons bring, and I guess I'm a fall and winter writer.
Do you find sometimes the characters pull you back in and you have to just stop what you're doing and go with it at that point?
Oh yeah, I mean, that old cliche, I guess, character is fate seems really true to me. I mean, because I don't have an outline and I don't know the plot and I don't know where the story's going, I have to ask myself, well, given who this person is, what would they do? Or given who these people are, what would happen? So the deeper you examine character, the more plot manifests as an inevitability. This character is fate. What happens is a function of who you are. And for me, that's the real fun of it. I don't think I could write if I had an outline and a plot and I was just executing a plan. I think I would just get worn down because it's kind of like running a marathon, writing a novel. It goes on for years, You've got to sit down every day with opening yourself to surprises.
How long did this take you to write?
Well, the trial was in 2013 and now it's 2022, so a long time. I did other things along the way. I published a book of poetry and a book of stories. And as we talked about earlier, I started out trying to write this as nonfiction. But I think once I hit my stride as a novelist and got engaged, about 3 years, once I sort of felt I knew what I was doing, probably about 3 years.
And Diana, how was he as a subject of an editor?
David is a very, very gracious and open-minded writer to work with. And I think there's always a balance between, the book is always the author's in the end. So you want someone to have a very clear idea of what they want the book to achieve. But it's also nice when there's a kind of openness to another set of eyes. And I think that makes the process go very smoothly. And we also, I think, David, the first time you and I spoke was it January of 2020 or February of 2020? It was right before the world sort of shut down. So that also added an extra layer of complication to our work.
Hence why you haven't met in person.
Exactly.
No.
Yeah.
When you were receiving David's manuscript, are you seeing a finished manuscript or are you just seeing pieces of the manuscript?
I read it was a complete book when I received it. Yep.
Wow. Well, it's quite a book. Let's see if there's anything left. Someone else asked a homeschooling question. Do homeschoolers ever have gatherings and get together and I guess parlay information together?
Well, yes, we, again, this is going back quite a while. When my kids were young in the late 80s, early 90s, and there were a few other homeschooling families, and we did a lot of things together. Parents had different skills, talents, abilities, and we sometimes would get together in groups and do things. And one of the things I talk about in the book is I think the term homeschooling is kind of a misnomer because it sounds like school at home, which is the last thing it is. It's really just learning in the world rather than being sequestered in an institution. You live in the world and everything is a learning possibility, which sounds romantic, and it is romantic, and it's not that simple. You still have to have some rigor and you've got to learn to read and write and so on. But to some degree, it potentially can be a much more sort of joyous and natural way for children to get an education.
I imagine there's a lot of people out there since 2020 feel like they're homeschoolers.
Yes, homeschooling became part of the public conversation with COVID. And I remember bringing that up with my publisher at the time. And they said, well, yeah, your book could find some readers in this new context. And I said, maybe, but everything in it seems a little bit dated now because it's all from the early 90s.
Well, yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
But I do think that the book offers a really good overview of the phenomenon of homeschooling. Like from every perspective, a social perspective, a psychological perspective, an educative perspective, a cultural, historical perspective. How did this thing develop? Now, here's a country that prides itself on individual freedom, but we have state-run compulsory schools. How did people respond to that in the early 13 colonies and so on?
Last question, because we're running a little bit short on time, is what do you have to look forward to? Are you working on something, or are you taking a break? Are you waiting for the winter to finish?
Well, I have gotten started on something new, and I'm interested in this phenomenon. It's happened a few times, and there's a film called The Little Buddha that's about this, where somebody in a Western country, in this case the United States, knock on the door. Tibetan Lama is there and says, "We think that your child is the reincarnation of a High Lama, and we think that your child should come live in a monastery and become a Lama, and you should allow us to take your child and do this." And so that's what I'm interested in. And there are a couple of cases of that right here.
Oh, really?
Close to home, yeah.
Wow. You have a lot of material in your own backyard.
Yeah.
Let me show everyone the cover, because I forgot to do that before. And I can't say enough good things about this book. It was just totally engrossing. And I would recommend it to everyone for this weekend or any weekend. And I want to thank you both, Diana and David, for joining us. It made Thursday evening a lot more interesting and a lot more entertaining than normal. So thank you both, and hopefully you'll come back with your next project.
Thank you.
Thanks, Diana. And I think
Thank
it's
you.
quieted down over there.
Yes, I know. I was going to say, can we send my children to a monastery? Is that a possibility?
Well, thanks, guys, and good night to everyone, and we'll see you next week. Bye,
All right.
everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Good night.